The firm of Bowen, McLeod and Britt helps both large corporations and small businesses with insurance, risk management, and employee benefits using the same values they've held true for over 30 years: knowledge, vision, accountability, and service. More information is at bmbinc.com.
Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, tourism might have taken off in more ways than expected this week when a new international nonstop flight began service. We will look tonight at the impact that this could have on both sides of the Atlantic. Lawmakers will be driving nonstop to Baton Rouge as the legislature begins its annual session. We'll look at what is being discussed, including tax plans and a possible prison system reworking. On the police beat, the debate has begun about the effectiveness of body cameras, and there is good and bad news about NOPD response time. In Washington, the American Health Care Act needs emergency care. We'll examine the impact of this on House Majority Whip Steve Scalise. On board with us are tonight's Informed Sources: Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources; Stephanie Grace, columnist, The New Orleans Advocate; Mike Perlstein, investigative reporter, WWL-TV Channel 4. And we are also hoping for Julia O'Donoghue with NOLA.com, the Times-Picayune, to join us. She was just a little bit delayed in getting here. So we're just going to get going, go over to Mike right now and talk about those body cams. And we saw the release of video this week of a body cam video from a police shooting that happened, what, in January of this year?
January the 24th. And that was a police shooting in which Artis Manning, a 26-year-old, was fatally shot by an officer during both a surveillance and ultimately a raid looking for multiple armed robbery suspect. They caught the armed robbery suspect, a gentleman named Harry Palmore, booked him in 3 different robberies, but it turns out that Artis Manning was not involved with the other suspect, was not accused of any armed robberies, and just happened to be wrong place, wrong time. The family of Artis Manning, obviously devastated by the shooting, protested the police actions, saying that he was not a target, a suspect, and questioned the police account that he pulled and pointed a gun at officers. Now we have the release of body camera video, and as you remember, this goes all the way back to former Chief Ronald Surpass, who implemented this reform, even though it was not required by the sweeping NOPD consent decree, but it is cutting edge to have cameras on, basically attached to the front shirt of officers to be turned on for any encounter on a call with suspects especially, and then most critically in situations like this, which involve confrontations. And what we saw by looking at this very short snippet, about 20 seconds really, of body cam video, was how limiting the body cam video is. If everybody thought that, oh, well, now everything's going to be on camera, we'll be able to see everything, who was right, who was wrong, it was quite clear that that is not going to be the final answer. And what we saw was very grainy, a video from a far distance that captured little snippets, but certainly not the whole encounter. And the critical question raised by the family is whether Artis Manning was armed with a gun.
What was the actual shooting captured?
There was no, the actual shooting was not captured, was not available on body cam video because this was during a foot chase. It turned a couple of corners, and that ultimately, when the shooting happened, the officer, who was, I would say, a good 30 yards or more away, had not turned that corner, so that was not captured. There was some aftermath of the suspect after he was shot, lying on the ground, and they chose not to make that public for obvious reasons. What they did show, what I thought was unusual, they showed a still photograph to the media of a holstered gun that they said was lying next to Manning's body. they did not make that public. They did not release that for us to air or for newspapers to print. And how that gun in a holster somehow was brandished and pointed during this chase remains an open question. What you do see when you take the critical frame of that body cam video and blow it up is basically what looks to be a black object in the hand of Manning as he's running. But there really is no way at all to tell what it is, if it's a gun. You know, we actually did get to ask some questions of the public integrity investigators. Now, this all comes about as part of an investigation by public integrity joined by the FBI to determine if this was a good shooting and whether the DA needs to be consulted for possible criminal charges against the officer. So
this instance still under investigation, but just generally, if you can sort of briefly summarize, how effective are these body cams? Are they helpful?
Well, see, now we know, and we've, the public and of course, including the media, has gotten to see very, very few of these body cam videos. We've requested them, and they've determined that they're only to be released in critical incidents in which they deem it's a public benefit. So we do not routinely get to see any body cam video. And now seeing the couple that we have seen, we realize that, in these heated situations where officers are running, jumping fences, that camera's on the chest of an officer who's, bolting across a courtyard of an apartment complex, ducking behind walls. The camera goes sideways.
So it's pointed at the ground. It's not always just extra clear.
Oh, no. And the quality is, especially at a distance, not good at all. You really can't see what's going on in the distance. But what I have heard is that perhaps the biggest benefit is that officers know that at least some of their actions are being captured on video. So some of the things that maybe officers in the past would have thought to try to get away with, whether it be unnecessary use of force, planting drugs or evidence, that they realize that there's a camera watching that.
And the body cams are here to stay, at least for now, because it's part of the consent decree,
no
too.
Doubt. It is now part of the consent decree, and furthermore, it's very strict policy under NOPD guidelines to the point where they're basically out of the grace period. If officers don't turn that on for even routine calls, they get disciplined, and it's even costing some of them one-day suspensions for not turning it on.
All right, Mike, thanks a lot. We're running over to Stephanie right now, and we're looking at a regular session coming up soon.
Yes.
Big part of it is changes in taxation.
Yes.
And the governor talked about his new tax plan today, and you were there, and you really pointed out that he kept saying something over and over again, which was...
Tops.
Yeah.
Tops, tops, tops. Tops 4 times.
And that's why we need to do this tax measures, to pay for tops.
That's one of the reasons.
Yeah.
I mean, it was his talk was kind of dry because it went through very specific tax proposals, and there are a bunch of them, and they're a little complex, but it also had a very strong message, which is to voters, basically, tops. There's a reason we're doing this, and it's because we want to fund things that you want, like TOPS. TOPS specifically for a couple reasons. One is because higher ed is always one of the areas that gets cut in tough years. And of course, this was the first year they didn't fully fund TOPS, so families that thought they weren't going to get tuition bills did get them. Right. And now families looking at the future are really starting to be uncertain about whether this will be available to them. And I think second, because it's a program that's very popular in a lot of Republican districts. And, so these are people who are going to pick up the phone and call some of the people who are going to be fighting him on the big tax proposal.
Right, and the governor's going to need those votes to get these tax proposals through.
Exactly. Another part of the message was also, I think, to regular people, because there are some business taxes that businesses are already trying to fight. And his message is, look, a lot of businesses, very profitable businesses, aren't paying their fair share. That means you're paying their share, you out there in the TV audience. So he was definitely trying to get a message across.
So the key points of his tax plan, would you say, are?
There are the controversial one, or the surprise one, really, is something called a gross receipts tax, which, there's been this task force going on, and Governor Edwards has been saying, for quite a long time, look, everybody knows what we need to do. Everybody knows what the answers are. The task force came up with them. Previous commissions have. And then he came out with this thing that the task force did not recommend, and really nobody has talked about, and he had not built any support for. It's based on a program in Ohio, and it's really designed to capture taxes from companies that have so many loopholes that even if they're very profitable, they're not paying income tax in the state. And there's a statistic he mentioned several times too. 149,000 companies in the state, 129,000 of them paid no corporate income tax in 2015. So, his message is not that we're trying to soak business, but that they're getting away with something. Businesses,
various tax breaks and
yes, exactly, which is something that he would very much like to close, and that's part of this too. But it's, every one of those loopholes has advocates.
Can I raise a question about TOPS?
Sure.
I know that in the debate, two schools of thought on how to save money on that. One is to have lower awards for more students, or higher awards for fewer students by raising the GPA requirements. What's the prevailing thought on that now?
Well, if there were a prevailing thought, I think we'd have a new policy. It's tough, and it's not just that, it's also, do you make it need-based? Because right now it's not need-based. So, and these are,
there was already a merit element. You had to keep a certain GPA. And
there is a merit element. Right. So the question is, it's, can you make it more competitive? Because right now it's not really aimed at the top students. It's aimed at kind of, maybe the better portion of students, but there is an argument that you want to focus it more clearly on really high-performing students. That's one argument. The other argument is you focus it on the people who need it, who wouldn't be able to go to college otherwise. And then there are all these other permutations,
Having been around a while, don't we now see from previous studies that giving it to marginal students who often don't finish college, drop out, becomes a questionable use of that scholarship.
That's an argument, but then there's a counter argument that they wouldn't have a chance otherwise, and this is incentive to them.
Okay, I'm going to deflect you guys away from the TOPS argument right now. Just real quick, back to just taxes generally. Quickly, on income taxes. Are we going to, just of regular individuals, is he proposing we pay less?
Well, that's interesting too, because again, another part of his message was, most of you individuals out there, you would be paying less if all of my proposals passed. So one of the things they're talking about is lowering the tax rates, but also getting rid of an exemption for your federal taxes, a deduction for your federal taxes, but that would have to go through a constitutional amendment, and they're worried voters won't support that. There's also a reduction in state corporate income tax, so there's something for business too. He's really aiming at the big fish that are really not paying that much.
Right, and it's also implementing now some sales tax that have been exempt.
And the sales tax, that's the other big piece of it. So remember, last year the legislature passed a temporary 1 penny sales tax to get out of the jam they were in then. It expires next year, but the feeling is that this is the year they need to deal with that, or else come up with alternative revenue, because it's a fiscal session and it expires next year. And then so the governor would like to get rid of that. That gives Louisiana the highest local and state combined sales tax in the country. They'd like to get rid of that. They feel like it's regressive, but they need to find that money somehow. And again, he's in this partisan situation.
So he would lift some exemptions to things that are exempt right now from sales tax that would start paying them.
So get rid of the temporary penny and extend it to services, to your cable TV, to landscaping, to things like that, not your internet, he was careful to say.
So we're going to see big arguing in the legislative session. Another big thing, of course, is prison reform and incarceration. And there was a task force that came up with a lot of recommendations. How are these recommendations sort of settling in right now?
One of the interesting storylines to this is, unlike the tax issue, there's some real bipartisanship behind it, and that's just something you don't really see in Louisiana much anymore, certainly not in Washington. But this is an issue nationally where you do have Republicans and Democrats kind of finding common ground on the idea that mass incarceration, and of course Louisiana has the highest rate in the country and the world, some people argue, is destructive in a number of ways. It's destructive to communities, and it doesn't necessarily keep communities safer. and it's very expensive. So that's where you get the conservative side.
Well,
so
based on some people who have followed this, it's actually been some years in the making as this has been studied, and now the task force is coming out with these recommendations. Is that label of having the highest incarceration rate in the nation really is starting to sting? And here's one of the reasons is that we're in this budget crisis, and it's very
hugely
costly,
expensive. Yes,
very costly. So they are looking at this on maybe the conservative side as a way to save money. On the liberal side, as a way to maybe reform your criminal justice
Give
system.
people a second chance, not let people who are incarcerated for very long sentences for nonviolent offenses, give them a second chance. It's a very wide-ranging package, and it has a lot of sponsors. The bills have Republican and Democratic sponsors. David Vitter is even helping with the Pelican Institute, so he's on the same side as John Bell Edwards, which is interesting.
So we're looking about changing sentencing guidelines and just incarcerating people for less time.
So that's part of it.
Certainly for nonviolent
sort
offenses.
Of some caps, like when inmates, and what we have with such long sentences are people locked up into their 70s and 80s, where the costs skyrocket for the housing of these inmates who require, sometimes very intense medical care paid for by taxpayers. So,
and are not necessarily a risk to the community.
Right. And what you have are now, and this is all going to be a subject of debate, I expect a lot of changes and iterations as it goes through the process, but ways to apply for an early release through parole or commutation of sentences for these elderly inmates.
And these could be violent offenders, have been convicted of violent offenses.
Violent offenders, one.
Not first-degree murder.
No, but also those who were convicted of nonviolent offenses, but multiple nonviolent offenses that got them multiple bill, double and triple bill, that extended their sentences, in some cases for several drug offenses. And those people who have never committed a violent crime are nevertheless taking beds in cells in our prisons.
But there is also consideration about older violent offenders,
and that's really
too,
going to be the most controversial part, probably,
Yeah.
because of course everybody's worried that you could let somebody out and something could happen. And the DAs are concerned about this, and victims advocacy groups are concerned about
that
this
already. So definitely we're going to see a very active legislative
And it's interesting.
session.
So Danny Martini, the state senator from Jefferson Parish, is carrying that. He's a Republican. He's very close to Sheriff Newell Norman, which is interesting. He's got real law enforcement credentials, but he knows that's going to be tough.
And that's another issue, too, is the sheriffs around the state. If we have less prisoners incarcerated, there would be less prisoners, state prisoners, going to local jails where sheriffs make their money. So that's another issue, too.
A lot of them
guys.
fund other
Let's go on over to
way.
Errol now. We've not forgotten you, Errol, way over there. But we have some good news about British Airways now.
The service began last Monday, and from the beginning it was announced that they were going to fly 4 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday. The plane comes in from London, then turns around, and 2 hours later. It's a great schedule. It leaves at 9:20 at night, and it arrives at noon the next time in London, which would be like around 7 in the morning our time. So it's imagine like getting on the plane at 9 o'clock at night and 7 o'clock the next morning, and you're in London. So it's a great schedule both ways. But the really good news is that in the past this has been attempted. In '82, British Airlines tried it. It didn't really work out, and there was another flight that went to Scandinavia that didn't work out. But the same day they started this flight, they said, by the way, we're going to add another flight in October, and they said we're getting a good response. And so in October, they're going to add a Tuesday flight. So last year, or in 2015, New Orleans was bidding for this flight, and it lost out to San Jose. And the reason it lost out to San Jose is San Jose has all that internet industry and Google and all that activity. And that's big money flyers. That's what the airline people talk of as being the front of the plane flyers, the people who fly first class. That's where the money is. New Orleans gets a lot of people flying to it, but they're back of the plane flyers, a lot of vacationers. And so they said, I guess the few front of the plane is equal to a lot of back of the plane. However, the citizens people were able to convince the British Airlines people that there is enough of an economic base here. They used Lake Charles to Destin is their market area. Instead, there's around 5 million people in there. And Mobile was very supportive of this and talked about, like running a bus from Mobile to Florida's rather than having to go through Atlanta or New York. And so they got good support across the way. And so if this develops, but the other thing that's happening is if you look at their website, that they're heavily promoting, on the London side, they're really heavily promoting New Orleans. So, we're thinking about it in terms of people here going over there, but the people over there coming here, and the big advantage to the national travelers is that they tend to stay longer. Local travelers might do a long weekend. International travelers, for the money they need to spend for the flight, want to stay at least a week to 10 days. And the city has invested, I think it's $4 million in London to promote coming to New Orleans for the next year. So there's a huge partnership here, but part of it involved the city or the region planning to try to market this to get people to come here.
Well, it's a good thing, too. I mean, we get to fly now from New Orleans, not stop over to England.
And then also in May, Condor Airlines starts to Frankfurt. And that might change the way people start flying, because a lot of people, if they're going to Europe now, a lot of flights go through Frankfurt anyway, because it's a big hub if you're going to Europe. And so if it's fairly easy and inexpensive to get to Frankfurt and make a connection there, that might be an attractive alternative.
Okay, Errol, thanks a lot. Quickly over to Stephanie right now. Yeah. Steve Scalise, the whip in the House, but the legislation they were trying to get through didn't even get a vote. It didn't even, it was called,
And he got, obviously, Paul Ryan is getting, and Donald Trump and the Freedom Caucus, they're getting kind of most of the blame or credit for this, depending on who you ask. But Steve Scalise is right in there. He's the number 3 person in the House, and a whip, his job is to line up votes and count them, know where they are. And as we know, this was a moving target all the way up until the end. It's interesting after the deal fell apart. First of all, we should say that Governor John Bel Edwards and the administration very happy it fell apart, because this saves the Medicaid expansion they've worked hard on. But Steve Scalise was on the other side of this as a member of the team. He, was out there with the talking points. He was one of the people who said, don't pay attention to the Congressional Budget Office report. Even before it came out, it turned out to say that 24 million people would lose their insurance. He said those are unelected bureaucrats, the kind of standard lines. And they just really weren't very effective against the emotion of this issue. So when it all fell apart, there were some questions over him. He got, if you saw that kind of crazy Judge Jeanine rant about how Paul Ryan should give him the speakership, which a lot of people, it's on Fox News, a lot of people saw because Donald Trump told people, his Twitter followers, to watch it. So, she said, and, where was Steve Scalise in all of this? Paul Ryan was asked whether he still had faith in Steve Scalise. Sean Spicer was asked whether the White House did. They said yes. I think... did he miscount? Probably not. I think it really was a moving target, and the Freedom Caucus people did seem to say, if you give me this concession, I'll vote for it, and then they held together.
On the other, maybe a glass half full version of this for Steve Scalise is that he actually did his job pretty well in counting the votes, realizing he didn't have it, and pulled the plug before a potentially embarrassing loss.
I mean, the worst thing that could happen to a whip is to take a vote to, you're right, there.
So anyway, Ryan's
on the other hand, but there was a strategy, Politico actually had a good report about the behind-the-scenes report, and they said, Scalise was one of the people pushing the strategy of just sending Trump in there to negotiate the closer, and that obviously did not work.
Real quick, Ryan says he's going to bring it back.
He does, but I think that's probably a long shot.
Okay, all right. Okay, over to Mike right now, real quick, too. NOPD response times. I mean, you guys did a big investigative piece on that, and response times were not good. It's gotten better since that time?
It has gotten better. Our series, NOPD Call Waiting, was obviously had a big impact because it led to a lot of police changes and reforms, and they, when you have some of the longest response times of any police department of any big city in the country, it's a problem. And in the first year, they really put pedal to the metal to bring those response times down. I think the overall all calls was down from an hour 47 to an hour 24. The numbers stalled out in 2016, and essentially what you had was, they made a lot of, changes to take some of the pressure off the existing officers, such as taking some calls over the phone, non-emergency calls over the phone. And what they did realize was that they're not going to make any further large improvements without more manpower. And that's one thing that definitely stalled out, despite promising to, have 150 recruits. to beef up the department. They fell well short of that. They hired 114, but the more important number is that they lost 109 in 2016. So they only had a net gain of 5 officers. So what they have done is made a little strategic shift in their thinking to basically accept these response times, which are now a little more manageable, clearly slower than anyone would like, but to take what little resources they can muster as sort of bigger department-wide task forces and target the most serious crimes. It started with what they call the Tiger Unit, focusing on armed robberies, which we've reported repeatedly that spiked in the last 6 months of 2016 into 2017, and looking particularly at serial armed robbers, following those patterns and making very swift, targeted, relentless pursuit of those robbers. It had such success in a short period of time, they've expanded that unit to now include shootings. Not homicides necessarily, but those aggravated batteries and attempt murders that don't end in a fatality. And they're hoping to get the same sort of success and to get wins that way by looking at the most violent perpetrators.
So prioritizing that way. I mean,
Yes.
what would be on the lower priority list, would you say, in terms of response times?
Of course, nonviolent crimes that aren't emergencies, car break-ins, burglaries, those are things where an officer can generally take that information over the phone. So they now have a response team that simply works the phones to take that information. There are some elements that they're hoping to do more with less by having electronic reporting where people can report their own crimes online, and a few other things that would require some legislative changes. And one big one is to have officers freed up from having to go to minor car accidents that don't involve injury.
Okay, well, we'll see how that goes. We have to look ahead. Quick point right now from you?
A quick question. There are some neighborhoods that pay extra for police protection in their neighborhood. Is there any evidence that they get any sort of quicker service?
Well, not really. We've studied those. They get quicker, maybe immediate response to the scene, but ultimately they still have to wait on a district officer to take a report.
All right. So, all right, well, we'll keep hoping. There's some progress made, so that is good news.
Yes.
Looking ahead.
Okay, well, this is the last weekend of the season for the fairgrounds. Tomorrow is the Louisiana Derby, and there's 2 storylines tomorrow. One is that the Decimo brothers from Maurice, Louisiana, who had a horse that finished second in the Derby last year and first in the Preakness, are running a horse tomorrow called Sorry Eric, and so they're going to be in there. But also the New Orleans Handicap, which is for 4-year-olds, Tom Vincent's horse, Mo Tom, who ran in the Louisiana Derby and the Kentucky Derby last year, will be running in that. So 2 races to watch tomorrow.
Steph.
Speaking of horse races, we finally have a mare's race. LaToya Cantrell made it official. She's going to be running, the first official candidate. I think the dominoes will start falling at this point.
Okay, Mike.
Hey, surprise legislation regarding the criminal justice reform, and I'm reporting on this today, bills to abolish the death penalty in Louisiana. And one of those bills on Senate side, introduced by a Republican, Dan Claytor of Baton Rouge.
Definitely a lot of interesting debate coming up in this legislative session. Thanks a lot, guys. And of course, Julia will have another time to talk to us about the legislature because she spends a lot of time up there too. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you again next week from Informed Sources. Have a good evening.
The firm of Bowen, McLeod & Britt helps both large corporations and small businesses with insurance, risk management, and employee benefits using the same values they've held true for over 30 years: knowledge, vision, accountability, and service. More information is at bmbinc.com.